All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our panel discussion on the Kirtland Snake Monitoring Project. This project is a partnership between the Sycamore Land Trust, which you'll see on there is abbreviated as SLT, and the Indiana DNR, which is the Department of Natural Resources. We have several panelists here tonight for you all who are all experts on this project and on the species. So we will get into it here in just a minute, but before we do, I just have a couple housekeeping things and some introductions to make. So please remember to use the Q&A function of the chat. So we want to make sure that this event is interactive for everybody. So you can pop any questions there in the Q&A, including any troubleshooting questions, and we'll do our best to help you out. If for some reason there are questions that we don't get to throughout this event, that is totally fine, because we will be sending out an email to everybody after the event within the next few days, answering all the questions that are asked. So if you ask a really good question and you want that answer, but we just don't happen to get to it, you will get your answer. So don't worry about that. Additionally, there is a closed caption feature here in Teams Live. So if you'd like to turn that on, if you prefer to have auto-generated captions, you can turn that on in these settings. Reminder also, before we get started, that we are recording this event, but we can't see anybody who's in the audience. So your face will not be on screen. We can't hear you. So don't worry about any of those things. Just sit back, relax, enjoy learning about snakes. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and start our introductions. So let's start with the screen that I'm putting up now, which is Nate and Chris. Will you two introduce yourselves?
Yeah, my name is Nate Engbrecht, and I work as the herpetologist for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources.
And I am Chris Fox, Land Stewardship Director for Sycamore Land Trust.
Excellent. And we will go ahead to our next screen here, which is Lindsay and Jason. Can you all introduce yourselves?
Hi, my name is Jason Myrtle. I'm the Assistant State Herpetologist, and I'm located in beautiful Bloomington, Indiana.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. I'm a student at IU studying biology, and I have been an intern with Sycamore Land Trust for about a year.
Excellent. Thank you both. And we've got Zach here with us as well. Zach, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, my name is Zach Trulock. Last year, I worked with Nate and Jason on the herpetology team and was really involved in kind of the early stages of this project and this partnership. So thanks for having me.
Excellent. And Zach's joining us all the way from Texas. So thanks so much for being with us here today, Zach. And my co-host, Sam Fain. Sam, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam. I am an outreach specialist and Mariah's co-host, and I'm just working behind the scenes tonight.
Thank you, Sam. And I'm Mariah. I'm on the outreach team here at the Division of Fish and Wildlife. I'm going to be hosting along with Sam, and Sam's going to be monitoring our Q&A. So thank you so much for that. And with all those introductions wrapped up, we will go ahead and launch right into the event. So we have some visuals here for you all. I will try to keep up with them as we're going through the questions. But our first topic that I wanted to touch on is just a little bit of background information about this event. So Chris, can you tell us a little bit about the Sycamore Land Trust as an organization and how the partnership between Sycamore Land Trust and DNR came to be?
Absolutely. Thanks, Mariah, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Hopefully, by the end of this, you'll be a big fan of the work we're doing and want to support what we're doing here to protect one of our state endangered species. I work for Sycamore Land Trust, and we are based out of Bloomington. We manage, we have kind of conservation management rights over about 12,000 acres in South Central Indiana on about 100 different properties. We have 30 miles of trails and 13 public preserves, but a big focus of the work I do is on our kind of our natural areas, if you will, areas that we work on restoring or protecting, and we do that often with certain species in mind or certain habitats in mind. And the partnership began back in 2021. We were in the process of planning a large restoration project on one of our properties, in which would involve some wetland construction. And we wanted to think about how do we best manage this property in the future? How do we make sure that what we're doing is having the impact that we intended? So a good way to do that is use science to get some baseline data And then hopefully after you do the restoration, you can do some follow-up research and see that the intended consequences of what your actions are getting the results you want. And so we wanted to, I wanted to survey as many species and many taxa groups as possible. So I started reaching out to different folks and reached out to Nate and, told him sort of our general idea, and we met. And from there, it's really blossomed into a wonderful partnership that's grown to include a lot of different properties and surveying for a lot of different herp species with a big focus on the Kirtland snake. And I'll kind of let Nate maybe follow up with some of that.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of the fun and kind of interesting parts of this collaboration that we've had is, one, I could kind of get the sense pretty early on working with Chris and his crew from Sycamore Land Trust that we had a lot of shared goals in terms of conservation of endangered species. His interest in amphibians and reptiles, not everyone is really into these sort of animals, so I really appreciated and valued his willingness and interest in these animals. And then it was also great to have a project that was kind of right here in our own backyard, because like Sycamore Land Trust and Chris and these guys, we're based out of Bloomington, but we actually cover the entire state. And we work with Indiana's 95 native species across the state. But this was a really cool opportunity to work with an endangered species right here in our own backyard in Monroe County. So definitely been a cool project right out of the blocks, and excited to talk about some of the developments that we've had here tonight.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nate. I appreciate that. And can you tell us a little bit about this thing called the Non-Game Wildlife Fund I've heard about that helps, fund a little bit of this work?
Yeah, so pretty much everything, or at least most of what we do in the DNR herpetology program, is driven by what's called the Non-Game Wildlife Fund. And that is a fund that is basically exists and is driven by donations from Hoosiers, folks from the public who want to make contributions to support the work we do. And what we can do actually is take the money from that fund and use it as match for federal dollars. So there's federal grants, these state wildlife grants, and we can use the money donated to the state through the Non-Game Wildlife Fund as match to acquire even more money. So you can see the image there. Someone were to donate $50, the Fish and Wildlife Service brings over $143 to the table. And so it's a really great way to contribute to conservation, not just of Kirtland snakes, but to a lot of non-game and endangered species. And it literally drives the work we do. Like, we're not sitting here with jobs if this fund doesn't exist, because it's what helps. And for several of my other colleagues, this is what helps get things done. So Hoosiers have a big opportunity to contribute, to the work that we're doing, at least on the DNR side, for studying these species and other snakes in the state.
Got it. Thank you so much for that explanation. And I love this slide because of this tiny little Kirtland snake. For anybody who hasn't seen this species before, I think this is a juvenile. Is that right, Nate?
Yeah, that's a photo Zach took actually, I think last year, of a very young of the year, probably recently born actually, Kirtland snakes on top of that quarter. So they do start out very small, but they do get bigger.
Awesome. Shout out to Zach for his photography skills, which brings me right along to our next slide here. This is my favorite snake photo I think that's ever been taken. So cool. Seeing the Kirtland snake pop out of that crawfish hole. Jason, can you let us know a little bit about the species? So just give us a little bit of background on the species for anybody who's not familiar with Kirtlands, and why their discovery on this property was relevant to the species as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. Firstly, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. We're always stoked when we get a chance to geek out about the work we're doing within the state. Like Nate said, we do have the whole state, but the work we're doing with Sycamore Land Trust is luckily for us, it's within Monroe County where our office is. So it's really nice to work within our county and close to the office. But yeah, this snake is it's actually a very unique snake for many reasons. This is a state endangered snake within Indiana. They do occur around surrounding states to us, as well as some outlying states. We're kind of the central hub for this species. We do have a lot of records within the state. They do occur much throughout the whole state in various types of habitats. They do occur in kind of unique areas. We do have a lot of populations in urban areas as well as suburban areas, and also in high quality habitats. These snakes are pretty small, usually less than 24 inches in length. They're a slender body snake. A lot of people are familiar with garter snakes, and these are kind of a smaller, in terms of body size, like a smaller version of a garter snake. And they're actually very secretive as well, even though they do occur throughout much of the state. A lot of people don't get to see them because they are so secretive. And this snake is also a fossorial species, so it spends much of its time underground, occupying various cavities, from mammal burrows to crayfish burrows. Especially crayfish burrows, we find them occupying in areas where a lot of crayfish burrows are. They do tend to like moist soils as well, so there's a relationship between the crayfish and the moist soils. And yeah, they're just a beautiful snake. You can see in the picture on your screen. They have a blotchy pattern on the top of the snake, and that can range from black, brown, some orangish color in there as well. A variety of colors, but they're usually kind of blotchy on their pattern. And then their belly has the orange belly with the little black spots on the two sides, and that's really an easy way to identify this snake, is by that orange belly and the black kind of dots that line that belly. And like I said, this snake does occur throughout much of the state, but a lot of people don't get to see the snake due to its secretiveness. And it's also known by some people that this is a darling snake of the Midwest. It's just a really neat species, and because of the habitats it is found in, it's just really unique in that regard. And working with Sycamore Land Trust and finding these snakes within their properties has really helped drive just their management and some of the projects that the Sycamore Land Trust and their crew is doing on some of these properties.
Awesome. The darling snake of the Midwest. I love that. What a boon to the species. And it's easy to see why. They're very charismatic and super cute, I think. So let's see here. Shifting focus a little bit back to the project that we learned about. It sounds like the partnership really came to be when the Sycamore Land Trust was planning a wetland restoration on the Sam Shine Foundation, I think, in Bloomington, right? And before starting that restoration, that the survey was completed, which allowed us to know that there were Kirtland snakes on the property. Chris, did this discovery change the restoration plans for the Sycamore Land Trust for that property?
Yeah, great question. It certainly did. When we decide on a restoration plan, there's a lot of factors that go into it. Everything from simply just having the funding to do it to what does the property lend itself to? There's a lot of decisions to be made. Do you do tree plantings? Do you do grassland plantings? Do you do wetland construction? So there are a lot of decisions that go into that. We speak to many experts to help us decide on these plans. It also comes down to what can we as an organization manage and maintain. So it's a not as simple decision to be made, but a one that we put a lot of effort in trying to make the right decision. And we came up with a management plan. We decided, as we mentioned earlier, we wanted to do some baseline surveys. Once we did those baseline surveys, we were, I think, a bit surprised. We knew that there were areas of the property that looked promising for Kirtland snakes, but they had not been discovered on this particular property. It is along Bean Blossom Creek, and there are known populations along the creek. But this was a former ag fields and had been in ag for a long time and had just previously ceased with the agricultural side of it. And I wasn't really expecting to find Kirtlands there. Not yet. We thought that would come after the wetland restoration. But in fact, we found some small pockets of Kirtland snakes occurring in some areas that bordered the agricultural fields. So that was exciting and also kind of created a bit of a question for us, is like, how do we go about this restoration plan? Because we think it's still a good plan, but how do we do that in a way that's not going to have a negative impact on the Kirtlands that occur there currently, and hopefully can help that population grow and expand? And so, we sat down and met with Nate and the staff here at the DNR, as well as we were working with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the NRCS. They were helping fund and plan the project. So we all sat down at the table and discussed, like, how can we still go forward with this plan? And so we ended up modifying the plan because of the Kirtland snake. Also because of some other discoveries we found on the property doing these baseline surveys. So it wasn't just the Kirtland, but that was certainly a main driving force because of its status in this, as Jason mentioned, the state endangered, as well as endangered or threatened in most of the states it occurs. So we knew that this was a sensitive species, and so we took that in mind, and we did modify the plans and adapted them in a way we thought was less impactful in a negative way on the snake, and still provided a habitat for the snake, as well as many of the other herp species, part of what the design was for originally anyway.
Got it. So I guess that kicked off the project, and it sounds like it did impact those restoration plans. Good to hear that. While the plans were tailored with Kirtland's in mind, it's also beneficial to the other species that you found on the property, and kind of a balance there, right? So Jason, I know you've been kind of involved on the ground in the field on a regular basis. So can you give us a little bit of insight on what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, and kind of what efforts are being made for this species and to collect data?
Yeah, day to day, Sycamore is helping as well on a day-to-day basis. But we started monitoring these snakes. We've been doing it for multiple years, like Chris and Nate alluded to earlier. But this year, we started surveying early in the spring. And what we did was earlier, like late winter, we went out to these newly constructed wetlands that you see here in the picture. And we ended up putting out cover boards along these newly created wetlands to monitor snakes, at these wetlands on the property. And there's quite a few wetlands that were built. And from our previous work, we knew of populations that existed down in these areas. And so what we wanted to do was to put cover boards at these new wetlands, and some of these are close to the populations where we knew where they occurred on the property. And we ended up putting all these cover boards out, and we ended up putting 100 cover boards out down on this property along these wetlands. And we went out and we monitored these cover boards throughout the year. And those, we usually check those cover boards twice a week, if not more if possible. Sometimes we do bring groups out from schools and things like that. So sometimes they do get checked more than that. But we go out and we basically just go out and we lift up these boards, and we just kind of note what species we're finding underneath the boards. And we find various species, from mammals to herps to spiders, all kinds of things could be underneath these boards. And then we take data on all the species, and for us, we're just documenting pretty much the reptiles and amphibians that we find underneath the cover boards. So we take some basic data. We're taking air temperature, what species we're seeing, of course, how many we're seeing, time of day, temperature, just a lot of just different metrics that we're collecting, and then we just store those in a database. And at the end of the year, we'll go back and we'll kind of go through all that data, and just compile reports and things like that to see how the year went, and see how these new wetlands and things are being how they're producing various amphibians. I'm sorry, getting a little bit of feedback, so I wasn't sure if everybody's getting that, but anyways, that's kind of the day-to-day. For me, I like to check cover boards at various times. So various times of the day, I might go out in the morning, say 1 week, and I'll check the cover boards. Then I might go out, in the evening. We've done some night surveys actually over the years, and I also check boards depending on weather. So I like to change it up because, all this is important data to gather. So when we're looking at the species, we have an idea that, how are these species, moving across the landscape, say, or when are they more prevalent to come out? So there's lots to learn, and it's ongoing, of course. But yeah, I just try to switch it up from day to day, and just to collect different data and see what we're seeing out there. But that's kind of the day to day.
Absolutely. And so just for a reference here in these photos, when Jason's referencing cover boards, I think this is a cover board next to you actually in the field, Jason, is that right? And then the critters would be underneath that cover board. So you kind of lift that up. Okay.
That's correct. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Yep, that is a picture of me there. And that is a cover board there. We use, the ones we're using this year are actually pieces of metal, and they're fairly large. They're about 3 feet in width and 4 feet in length, so they're fairly large. And we've used other ones in the past, and other folks, this is a very common survey technique for reptiles and amphibians. And some people use wood and carpet and foam and stuff like that, but we're just strictly using metal for this particular project this year. And but yeah, we just get scrap pieces of metal. Some are actually painted different colors, so that's kind of maybe important to know, because some are, say, white, and then some are like kind of rusty, because what we do is get scrap metal. So they're all different colors and, kind of sometimes even shape a little bit, but depending on the color, the heat, that it generates is different depending on the color. So it's kind of interesting. You'll see maybe, snakes on a cold day, they might be maybe occupying a cover board that absorbs heat more than, say, a light colored cover board. So just some differences there. And then on the right is on the picture there is just a scale on a cover board, and you can see that one is really rusty, and that's kind of what I'm talking about with cover boards that are rusty, not painted. Where the one I'm kind of kneeling by is actually that's a pretty white one, pretty colored, or just painted white. It's actually kind of newer looking compared to that other one. And then that's a scale. Sometimes at certain properties we are taking weight measurements, and this is just a photo of us taking a measurement on this snake, and we usually put them in a little Ziploc bag just to kind of keep them contained, because they will, of course, squirm around and get off the scale. So it's an easier way to get an accurate measurement, and we'll use a new bag per snake as well, because we are also concerned about diseases and stuff like that. So.
Man, I just muted and unmuted myself. So that's one for anybody who's counting in the audience. I don't know if anybody's been in a meeting recently where somebody didn't try to start talking when they were muted. Thanks for that explanation, Jason. I appreciate it. It's good to know that that's a scale. I was kind of wondering what was going on there. And, assuming that those snakes get released right back outside after they're weighed, right?
Yeah. We release each snake back underneath the cover board, actually. So we don't relocate them anywhere, within the property or anything like that. We just put them directly underneath the cover board, exactly where we found them, actually. So, because these snakes are, they're actually, in my opinion, I think these snakes are pretty smart. You could lift up a cover board, and one of these snakes, because like I said earlier, they do occupy burrows, and I don't know if I said it last time, but they're considered a fossorial snake, which means they spend most of their time underground. And a lot of times you'll lift up a cover board, and that snake will beeline it towards the burrow that they pretty much occupy or they're familiar with. So it's very interesting that they almost like a homing instinct. They know exactly where to go at times. So sometimes you have to be quick. You lift up these cover boards. You have to be quick to get that snake, because they know exactly where they need to escape to, and they'll head right for that spot. So.
Got it. That definitely makes sense. Okay, so Lindsay, it sounds like you're out in the field a lot on this project as well. Was there anything you wanted to add about the day-to-day, week-to-week efforts? I mean, Jason's letting us know that you all are checking these in a variety of weather conditions, temperatures, times of day to make sure that our data is diversified and we're being able to, track habits of these snakes over time, which is awesome. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add, and I think Jason could probably agree, is that it's hard to define kind of what a typical day looks like because you never really know what to expect when you're going out into the field. So, for example, one day I may go out and check all the boards, 275 boards, and maybe find minimal amounts of animals under them. And then other days I'll just go out and they're everywhere. And so each time you lift up the board, it's just kind of a surprise as to who may be under there waiting for you. And that's really a part of this field work that I've enjoyed during my internship. And it's just exciting every day, and every day is different. So that's one thing I would probably mention as well.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Just like you said, lifting up a cover board, it's almost like a Christmas present, opening a Christmas present. Yeah. You don't know what you're gonna, get, so it's really cool in that regard. And like, Lindsay was touching on the fieldwork aspect, and, it's quite challenging out there, to be honest with you, because we're out there, I'll go out on a rainy day, like I said, just to change it up. And so you're out in the weather, in the conditions, and, from spring to fall, we're out there. And, the picture on the left, me kneeling next to the cover board on the wetland, you see the vegetation is really low. Well, that's because, these wetlands were constructed last year. Well, that vegetation this year got to be about my height, 6 feet tall. So, once the vegetation starts growing, we have to bushwhack through, deep vegetation, and it's challenging. And then this year it was really hot. So, we were in a drought there for a while, and we had lots of hot days, and, you just got to go out there though, and you got to get the work done. So it could be quite challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I got the honor or privilege of going out with the team a couple of times this summer, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But I can definitely give you guys props for going out there and dealing with those conditions all the time, and not to mention hoping field mice don't run up your leg and things like that when you're out there. Sounds like a super cool gig, but every cool gig has some challenges as well. So thanks for that insight there. Okay, so I want to toss it to Zach now, who you'll see is featured in our next slide. Zach, I know that last year you worked on this project really heavily, and were kind of involved in the foundation of the project, and specifically talked with us a little bit about, or specifically you were really involved in facial recognition, which I didn't even know that was a thing for snakes. So can you just explain a little bit about your role on this project and what all you did to help get it to where it is today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, last year when I came on, we were doing a lot of kind of surveys for populations of Kirtland snakes and all the, Sycamore Land Trust having all these properties and being such a cooperative partner. We were really interested in finding populations of these guys in as many places as we could. But I was also interested in trying to track individual snakes, and there's a variety of ways that can be done, but a lot of them are somewhat, they cause a level of interaction with the animal that has a cost-benefit, decision making. You have to weigh that when you're thinking about how to design your projects. And so I was really interested in trying to find a way to track these individual snakes without adding too much of a burden, both on our resources or, potentially adding too much stress on the snakes. And so I kind of came up with this facial recognition idea where you look at the snakes, and in my case, I was looking at the pigmentation often on the lips of the snakes. to kind of compare and keep track of individuals. So I would catch a snake, take photographs from a whole bunch of angles, each side, top and bottom, and upload those to a database and compare them to, oh, sorry, I think they were trying to find there it is. So there's the photo of those two snakes there. That's the same snake. I believe that one was about 3 weeks apart. But if you zoom in, you can actually see like the pigmentations and all the different shapes and colors. And that can be, at least within a season, can be a really good way to actually identify those individuals. And so I kind of started doing that for a few properties and seeing if I could actually recapture snakes. And I did actually have some really interesting recaptures and showing snakes moving between boards, and kind of building on what Jason was saying earlier about these snakes really like knowing their environment. I had a really interesting observation of a gravid female, which is just another word for pregnant for snakes, basically. And snakes, or what we used to call cold-blooded, they have to regulate their body temperature kind of by moving through the environment. If they want to warm up, they have to go to warm places. And so gravid or pregnant snakes, they really need to be as warm as they can for as long as they can for their metabolism to really kind of develop those their embryos and their babies. I should have mentioned this first. These snakes give live birth, so that's kind of unique in that way too. So I had a few gravid females that would hang out at our boards and actually use them to gestate as a nice warm spot to hang out and kind of cook their babies. So that was a really cool observation.
Sounds really cool, Zach. I didn't even know that facial recognition was a thing for reptiles or amphibians. And so what we're seeing here, it sounds like these are the same snake. You mentioned a few weeks apart, which is really cool to note. And I would imagine helps you all better track that data about their movements and things like that when you can determine whether or not it's the same snake. So that sounds really cool. Zach, is that something that's like, do we use AI or some kind of program that helps match snake to snake, or is that something that you do manually? What does that look like?
Yeah, I was doing it all completely manually. Just as I went out in the field and found snakes, I would come back to the office, upload the photos, pull up all the snakes from that site, and actually compare. Okay, I found this snake today. Is this one the same? And then on and on, so forth for all the different snakes. So it's something we're interested in and maybe looking into. It would obviously be it does take a lot of time to do this manually.
It definitely sounds like it. Lindsay, I know that you're currently working on the facial recognition patterns. Was there anything that you wanted to add about that? I see you here in this photo, so I wanted to see if there was anything about that part of the project you'd like to weigh in on.
I think Zach covered it pretty well. I am going to be working on comparing his photos from last year against our snakes this year to see if we have any like repeat users over the past 2 years. So I think that could be an interesting little bit of information if we are able to find snakes that overlap between years.
Thank you. Nate, I'm going to put you on the spot here real quick. And I want to make sure that we're, kind of explaining what's on all of these slides. So I think I'm going to back up a little bit. Thanks to everybody in the audience for bearing with me while I was looking for the slides there. But Nate, if you could just kind of explain some of these photos. In this one, we've talked a lot about like laying out cover boards. Can you tell us a little bit about, is that what we're looking at here, I'm thinking?
Yeah, it is. We have been, as Jason described, deploying cover boards kind of at several of these Sycamore Land Trust sites. But as we begin working at one of the more recently acquired properties here north of Bloomington, we started finding a lot of Kirtland snakes in areas that were kind of like naturally restored. It's like a restored wetland, basically, but it's surrounded by agriculture. And so we started thinking, especially because this is no-till agriculture. Could these Kirtland snakes actually be out in the ag fields? That's not thought to be a good habitat for them. They tend to like open canopy, grassy, moist soil, or wetland habitats. But here we had a situation where we had a wetland that was surrounded by agriculture, and it was no-till agriculture, which means they're not disrupting those crayfish burrows that the snakes like to inhabit. And so it seemed like a unique opportunity to kind of see if snakes would use a no-till agriculture field where the burrows are intact compared to like traditional tilling techniques where it would actually like crush the burrows and the crayfish would have to build new ones. And so you can see in that aerial photo or that drone photo on the left there, we attempted to deploy cover boards in arrays where there's one line of cover boards that ran through the soybean field and the other one ran through the grassland. The challenge is that we put these cover boards out before they planted, and so we didn't exactly know where the planting line was going to be because it kind of depends on how wet and flooded it is out there. But in any case, we ended up having cover boards in these soybean fields, as you can see on that photo on the right there. And so that was one of our approaches to see if they would use that kind of habitat. And I think I'm going to talk about the results of that here in a little bit.
All right, excellent.
I'll save it. Yeah.
So Mariah, I'd like to just to tag along with that and just say that, you know, we're all kind of science nerds here. You know, I'm not sure if all of our audiences, hopefully they are, and they can appreciate that comment. But the one thing about science is, and people that aren't as into the sciences sometimes fail to understand completely, is that science often makes you realize there's more questions than there are answers, you know. And so when we started digging into this in the beginning, we're like, where are there Kirtland snakes, you know, so that we could maybe design our restoration to help those populations. But then as we started digging into that, we'd find them someplace and be like, well, why are they here? And then we try to find a way to answer that question, and it just creates more questions, which to me is what's so fascinating about science and gets me excited, because we never know everything. In fact, we usually just end up finding out how little we do know. But we are attempting to try to figure out a few things about this snake, because, you know, even though we're into protecting natural areas, we have to also try to think about ways that we can live in the landscape, of course, and ways that we can do that and maybe be coexist better. And these farmers here, in this case, we're using, as Nate mentioned, no-till agriculture, which is common in certain areas and less common in other areas. And we're seeing that maybe there's a difference between how these snakes are interacting with these landscapes. And maybe in the end, the information we learn can help Sycamore manage our lands better, and maybe other conservation groups, but maybe we can share that with the public, and maybe they can find ways that they can coexist with the snake as well. And so I just thought that was a nice point that I wanted to make sure the people understood, that I feel like a lot of what we're doing here, and we'll talk more about this tonight, is having an impact beyond our borders, like Sycamore's borders, or even maybe the DNR's borders, that we can impact on a bigger scale. Our science might be helpful to other groups, and maybe some of the things we learn can be helpful to other people managing land, whether it's a private landowner or a conservation group.
Absolutely. I appreciate you weighing in there, Chris. I think that's super important to know. And like you mentioned, and like with most scientific things, once you start learning something, you really just learn how much you don't know. And you all are taking steps to, you know, continue moving the needle on what we know about the species, which is really, really cool. So I want to look at our next slide here as well with these photos, because I'm not 100% sure what's happening here, and I want to make sure that I understand it. So Jason or Lindsay, can one of you guys explain what's going on here? I think we mentioned, you know, kind of in our before chat that this was radio telemetry, which is another tracking technique, but how does that work? If you could just briefly touch on that.
Yeah, so in addition to facial recognition, we've also been attempting to use radio telemetry. Since there is such limited data on how this species moves in general, we thought it would be a good opportunity to see if we could use radio telemetry to learn more about this species and what we can do to better understand what it needs and contribute to conservation of the species. So essentially how it works is we're attaching a very small radio transmitter, which is the little white thing you see in the picture. So it is pretty small in comparison to the snake. And what this does is it sends out a signal for us that we can pick up using an antenna and a radio transmitter that helps us identify where on the property this snake is. And the benefit of this, especially for this species, is that it can also tell us where the snake is, even if it is underground. It can still pick up the signal. So that's very helpful because this species can spend a lot of time underground. But it is quite tricky with this species because, as we mentioned, it's fossorial, so it is using these burrows, which are very wet. It's also rubbing up against like wet substrate, like wet grasses and mud. So it's hard to find the right material to use to attach these tags to the snakes without it getting wet and just kind of slipping off. So it's been a lot of trial and error, but we've learned quite a bit this year, and looking forward to using what we've learned in tracking them next year.
That's super helpful. Yeah, I would imagine that would be super tricky with the just tubular shape of, I'm sure that's not the scientific term, but the shape of a snake, you know, there's not really any way to get that to hook on there, but super cool that it tracks them underground. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to fast forward past this next slide because we talked about that, and jump right in to kind of what our results are so far. So Nate, you know, we've heard a little bit about the different techniques that are used to track and gather data for this species, but what are the results that you guys have found so far? And what does that mean for our collective scientific understanding of the species overall?
Yeah, so one of the fun things about working with a species like Kirtland snakes is that there's actually still a fair amount that's not known about their biology or their natural history, how they use the landscape, population sizes, movement patterns has been like a black box of Kirtland snake biology. Nobody really seems to know how far they move because they're small and they're hard to track, and they spend a lot of time underground. So a few of the kind of cool, maybe sciencey micro breakthrough sort of things that we've had in our project, I'll break them down to 3 different ones. We have gotten some insights into Kirtland snake movements, actually mainly through the photo mark recapture technique that Zach started out last year and that Jason and Lindsay have continued this year, basically finding a snake, getting those photographs of its face, refinding it later on in the year, and then kind of being able to measure the distance between those 2 sites. And in some cases, you have snakes that have been caught multiple times, and you can get some distances. So we're starting to kind of chip away on that that black box of you know how far these snakes move. Not a ton of information, but we are getting some information on Kirtland snake movement, which is really cool. Aside from the technique being kind of an experimental thing, we've gotten some nice movement data. The somewhat surprising thing has been Kirtland snakes showing up in these no-till agricultural areas. The site I mentioned north of Bloomington that has the wetland with the no-till soybeans and actually has some corn around it too. Those cover boards that we had out in that soybean field, it wasn't super far from the edge of the wetland, but it was in, you know, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 meters. We got several Kirtland snakes. I mean, all around different sides of the wetland area. They're out in the soybeans. We actually were getting Kirtland snakes using that no-till soybean field. And I think a big reason is well, partly because they like hanging out under cover boards. And so it does provide them actually some cover in the field that wouldn't naturally be there. But we try to lay these boards on top of crayfish burrows. And so, you know, they're probably coming up from the crayfish burrows, hanging out there under the boards. But seeing them use no-till ag, I think reflects maybe, I guess I hesitate to say compatibility, but it definitely shows that they can use that. I don't think it's really preferred habitat, but there is at least some compatibility, it seems, with no-till style agriculture around a natural habitat like that. So that's been pretty interesting. And actually next year we plan on kind of leaning into that even more by putting cover boards further out into the agricultural fields and seeing how far these things will really, if they really are using these kind of fields maybe more thoroughly rather than just on the edges near the grassland habitat. And then finally, I don't know, this is maybe the more hope-filled thing, is that we've just seen Kirtland snakes using these post-agricultural restoration sites. So sites that were under either cultivated farming, whether it was till or no-till, or even grazing, that are now kind of restored areas. We're finding Kirtland snakes at those sites. And so I think it was last year or maybe 2 years ago, we started finding them at some restored sites that were had been restored maybe like 15 years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, putting out cover boards next to those wetlands that were created last fall, and finding Kirtland snakes using those gave us a really near-term, like time-wise near-term view of like, holy cow, these things are starting to like use these wetlands almost immediately after they're built. And that's a really good sign when we start thinking about Kirtland snake management and recovery, you know, the implications of, you know, that sort of thing, and how we can kind of maybe expand existing populations or recover some that are still hanging on. And so those have been some, I would say, 3 takeaways on the kind of the sciencey investigative side that has shed a little bit more light on how Kirtland snake work, how they work, and how they're using the landscape in areas where you kind of have a matrix of wetlands and agriculture happening at the same time.
Chris, so it sounds like we've learned a lot about these snakes. Can you tell us a little bit about how these discoveries are impacting the next generation of conservationists? So kind of a big picture look of next steps for this project, but also for conservation as a whole.
Yeah. Well, for those that know me fairly well, know I was coached for a long time, 17 years, and I love working with young folks and teaching. And so this is kind of an extension of that for me. One of my highlights of my job is working with interns and young people, and a lot of people on here I consider young. So I'm getting to that point where everybody is younger than me, it feels like at times. But just like the Zach in the photo recognition, that's a new technique for this species, and it's pretty it's really cool to see that, and the young people bring that energy, and now Lindsay and Jason are carrying that on, and we just had a meeting today to talk about how we're going to do the field work next year, and talking about bringing in some other young interns and young professionals to help us continue this work. I'd love to be out in the field more, but sometimes we get stuck in meetings or planning the next step, and we've got to have those folks to step up and bushwhack, as Jason said, through the weeds and out in those hot days, which I've done that, and I know it can be miserable at times, but it can be great because it is like Christmas under every cover board. And I think for me, I remember still, it seems like yesterday, being a student and being excited to want to get out there and do the work instead of just read about it in a book or sit in a lecture and hear about it. I was like, I want to get experience, and sometimes getting experience is one of the hardest things to do when you're young, because people want somebody with experience already, and it's like, well, it's kind of the cart before the horse here. I need to get the experience. Will somebody give me the chance? And so we've got, we're in Bloomington. We've got tens of thousands of students there ready and willing to do field work. And so this is a great opportunity to do it, because it takes training. So I don't want to minimize that, but it doesn't take an exorbitant amount of training to show someone how to flip a cover board and how to identify species, and with phone apps, and you can take pictures and we can look at it later. There's a lot of ways we can train young folks to get that hands-on field experience. And it really, sometimes it just takes a little bit of time out there, and they're hooked for good. And for me, we've worked with high school students. We had one working for us in Columbus that worked with the DNR and us on some surveys for us. And that student's now in college, advancing his career and studying herps there. I've had a lot of students go on to work on their masters and PhDs. Lindsay's been phenomenal in taking the torch and taking it to the next level. And so I think for me, it's about giving them that opportunity, and I'm always willing and open-minded to learn from them as well. Even if they're new, they can come up with new ideas. The young folks are so technologically advanced, especially more so than me. So they can bring new technologies to me, or they can understand the technology we're struggling with. The facial recognition we talked a little bit about, and we've been doing that all manually. Lindsay does that on her computer, but AI is an opportunity for us to maybe be able to do more as our database grows with pictures. We're going to have to find a way to be able to manage that. So AI might be a way, and the young folks might be able to do that for us. So I think it's created opportunities for them. It's certainly allowed us to do the work. Without them, it wouldn't be possible to have those young folks helping us, out there in the field gathering the data. So yeah, I think this project is very timely in that the Fish and Wildlife Service is re-examining this species for federally listing. And so these students get an opportunity to work on something that's really relevant beyond the scope of Indiana even. This is, a potential listing, and it may not be listed federally, but at least to get a chance to work on that. One of my highlights was getting to work with a federally endangered species. I got to do some work on some endangered birds, and that was really, it felt really impactful. Not that what we do in our backyards isn't, but it can really bring a certain level of intensity to it that, this has really big impacts. So, yeah.
Insight, Chris. I really appreciate that. We have a couple minutes here before we jump into audience questions. So I wanted to just throw it back to Chris and Nate, if you guys want to tag team this one. How can folks get involved or support this project and other conservation work like it if they're inspired to do so, or if they're interested in this species, other herps, or just other rare critters in general? How can they do that?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take the lead on this one. I guess from the DNR standpoint, we're always interested in kind of knowing where rare species occur. So in the DNR herpetology program, there's only 2 of us full time with this program, and we cover the whole state. So that's 2 sets of eyes, and that's it. And so there's whatever 6 or 7, 8 million people in Indiana out there, and lots of eyes on the ground. So anytime you see a species that's listed as endangered, especially Kirtland snake, we're always interested in getting some information on that if you're comfortable reporting it. If you do see a Kirtland snake, and again, this was mentioned earlier, these things have a knack for hanging out in urban and suburban areas. You can find them in cities. We have a lot of records from the Indianapolis area, including several from inside the 465 loop. If you find a Kirtland snake and you can get a photo of it with your phone, you can actually report that sightings to the email address on the screen. That actually goes to my inbox, herpsurveys@dnr.in.gov. There's also an online kind of citizen science reporting tool called Herp Mapper, and you can do a Google search for Herp Mapper, and there's a way for you can actually upload your photo and your record and catalog it that way. And I have access to the Indiana records, and so I can find the record that way. And it doesn't just have to be actually endangered or even listed as special concern to report it to Herp Mapper. You can report it any amphibian or reptile observation from around the state, or actually in any state, to this online database. And it's an awesome way to just contribute what you're seeing to the larger kind of collective of scientific information. And so I think on the state side, there's that. We talked also about donations to the Non-Game Wildlife Fund. That's what helps get things done around here. But I'm curious, Chris, how they can contribute on your end as well.
Yeah, well, as Nate said, we're kind of in the same boat. A state agency and a nonprofit, but this non-game side needs your funding to help support the work they do. And hopefully by now you realize, if you didn't know already, how important the work they do is. We're a nonprofit, and so we rely on donations from donors and members. And so we really rely on your support to help us do the work we do. And we apply for some grants and things like that, but we really rely on people's generosity to help support what we do. So we would appreciate that, anyone that's interested. I'd also just like to add that this partnership, I think, shows it's kind of like, it's like a match, if you will. Like, people are always fundraising, say, hey, we'll give now because you can get a match. Well, that's kind of the way it is here. You can support one of us or both of us, but we're working together. And I can say that in with all honesty, these folks work really hard. I've always enjoyed working with them. We were kidding around earlier about, it's just fun to get together and talk snakes and talk herps. But they're more than partners, they're friends. And I can say that your money will be well spent because they do excellent work and work really hard. So I'm proud to be a part of this team and this work.
Thanks, man. It's a fantastic partnership.
Right. Well, what a way to end the formal presentation part of this event. Thank you both so much. And thank you to all of you who have spent your time on here talking about the project and in general working on the project. Super important work. And I've definitely learned a lot. So I appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to kind of jump into some audience questions here. So we will, I think Chris and Nate could tackle this one, but we have a question here that says, are there any specific methods that you use to survey land areas to decide how to restore them for specific species in mind? So more information about what that survey process looked like.
A great question, and there are many different ways to do that. One is just work with the experts. If you've got something in mind, like I did, I wanted to survey herps, so I go to the state herpetologist. That's one way. Obviously, there's also, the state keeps a database, a natural heritage database that has a lot of information. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, if you're interested in rare, threatened, or endangered species, we just contacted them recently to find out. They can share a database. Now, they won't share that maybe widely with the public necessarily, just because of sensitive information, but they can share that information. So if you're really focused on, if, for instance, we're looking to protect a certain species and looking at property we might want to acquire, we might go to them and say, where are some locations for some rare, threatened, endangered species? Bats, for instance, are really, a hot topic right now because of their declining populations for a variety of reasons. So if we want to protect bat habitat, we might contact Fish and Wildlife Service and find out where would be a good place for us to protect land, or we have land in an area we know as bats occur. What can we do to help that species? So there is a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of different groups you can go to, the DNR, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or a couple great places that have a lot of information, a lot of experts that you can contact.
Excellent, thank you. Hopefully that was helpful, Holly. We have another question here, and we'll see. I don't know if Zach could maybe weigh in on this one. Can Kirtland snakes exist in the same habitat as other species of snakes, specifically water snakes?
Yes, they certainly can. And I'm sure Jason and Lindsay can also attest that they frequently use the same boards and even at the same time. They're real, at least the populations we were working with, very wetland surrounding populations live in the wetlands, and there's water snakes, garter snakes, bracers, rat snakes, brown snakes, and a variety of other species that are sharing the habitat and in some cases the same board space.
Right, good deal. And that brings us to our next question here for Jason and Lindsay, both of you or whoever would like to tackle this one. Have you ever had any big surprises when you've lifted a cover board? Anything unusual kind of jump out?
Well,
Let you go.
I'll go first, but going back to what Zach just said, it's really interesting. You could lift up a cover board and there could be multiple species coexisting with each other underneath that board. I mean, from, mammal species, various types of reptiles and amphibians. It's pretty amazing that you have these animals sharing this one spot, even though, a snake might be, one of the species might be, something that snake would eat, but they're still coexisting within that cover board. So that's really neat. And also just the ability to see various species, because sometimes you do get some unique species that pop up that we're interested in ourselves. So for instance, at one of our sites, we got to experience a snake that is not seen very often in Monroe County. And I was able to observe that species multiple times at this one site. So that's kind of neat to see that. So, do you have anything to add?
I would just say to add some Q factor. I think one of the coolest things I ever kind of stumbled upon was just an eastern box turtle just chilling on top of the board like he owned it. And it was a nice sight to see because the eastern box turtles are very, very important.
Absolutely, very cool. So let's see here. Along the lines of, the coexistence that Jason was talking about, having multiple species found underneath the boards, will a Kirtland snake share the crayfish burrow if they're using that burrow, or do they displace the crayfish, or are these usually abandoned burrows? What does that look like?
My experience is they will occupy the same burrow that the crayfish is in as well. So there's definitely a lot of unknowns for us on that, but I've witnessed a snake utilizing the same burrow that the crayfish is basically in. So Zach, I don't know if you've had some experiences on that.
Yeah, very similar to you. I've seen them using the same burrows as the crayfish, and this is a really kind of. It's known that these snakes are very reliant, or at least in some cases, on crayfish. They frequently use their burrows, but a lot of kind of their ecology and how they interact is not very well known. So they will use the crayfish burrows. They will sometimes eat crayfish. There's been a few cases of them, found in their stomachs. But the burrowing crayfish are a really big force on the landscape. They make a ton of burrows. I saw, crayfish actively digging burrows, and that's a thing that would often happen under the boards, is that the crayfish would dig new burrows and new tunnels, and really, so once you lift the board, sometimes, it would just be like a little network of tunnels from the crayfish activity. So they're a really important part of the landscape that, at least in some cases, these snakes really depend on.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Zach. And I am going to go ahead and throw the mic over to Chris. I think Chris had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to take away if there's other questions, but one thing that people might be wondering is like, so what? Like why protect the Kirtland snake? I mean, most likely I'm preaching to the choir with this group because they're here because they are interested anyway. But some groups, I show them a picture of a Kirtland snake and I think it's cute. The cuteness factor, as Lindsay mentioned, but they're just kind of rolling their eyes saying it's a snake. It can't be cute. There's no way. But, I'm a big fan of Aldo Leopold. If you read Sand County Almanac, and it said, the first step of intelligent tinkering is to keep every cog in wheel. And that the Kirtland snake has a purpose on the landscape. And we may not fully understand it, even as scientists, but to me, I think we have a responsibility to protect all species, and especially those that are vulnerable and declining or struggling a bit. And so that's why it's important to me. And I would protect it anyway, just because I care about animals and in nature. But I just wanted to throw that out there as food for thought. You may not ever see the snake because it is secretive, but hopefully you still care that we're looking at it and we're protecting it. And today we're sitting there eating lunch and talking about how to protect this snake and all the research we're doing. And I was like, I don't think there's many other people out there eating their lunch talking about Kirtland snakes. Hopefully there are. But we are, and we're out there doing it, and I hope that makes people excited to want to support this work and get involved any way they want to get involved.
You could not be more on point there, Chris. I appreciate you adding that so what language. That's so important. Zach, I think you had something else that you wanted to add as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. That was a real great way of laying it out. But I also just wanted to add that these snakes are kind of special for Indiana. Indiana's really kind of centered on the heart of the range, and we seem to have the most populations, particularly in southern Indiana. So it's a real special part of the natural history of the state that we have these snakes.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I know I would love to sit here and talk about Kirtlands for quite a while, but we want to be respectful of the audience's time and everybody, all of our panelists' time. So I wanted to extend a heartfelt thank you so much to all of the panelists who spent their time tonight talking with us about this really cool species and what the future looks like for them and what the efforts are to making that a positive future. And thank you so much to everybody in the audience as well for spending your time with us this evening. Just as a reminder, we will be sending out a follow-up email within the next several days that have answers to any questions we didn't get to tonight. So if your question wasn't answered, we will get to that still. We'll also provide all of the helpful resources. Sam, thanks so much for popping all those resources in the chat for us throughout this event. But all of these links and resources that you might want to revisit will be sent out in that post email as well. So thank you all so much. And with that, we will let you get back to your evening. Thanks a ton. Bye.